favorite traditions at each of our meetings is to recognize any of our first-time guests and new members. If you have a new member ribbon or a name tag, please stand so we can give you a warm BFF round of applause. New members, yes, I know you're out there. I'd also like to recognize all our generous sponsors and supporters. When I announce your name, I ask that all representatives from the company please stand so we can recognize you and remain standing until all the names are read, and we'll hold our applause until the end. Our presenting sponsor, Whittier Rehabilitation Hospital. Our supporting sponsors, Cedar Law, Human Power Solutions, Unibank, and Middlesex Savings Bank. I know there are some representatives from these companies out there, so please stand so we can recognize you. And special thanks to our BFF friends and supporters of today's event, Cyprian Peace Golf Club, and Karen Henderson from Westboro TV. Please join me in giving them all a warm BFF round. Unfortunately, Becky couldn't make it today. She typically gives a few sponsor remarks from Whittier Rehabilitation Hospital. She wasn't able to make it. And also, Karen is ill today, and she was also unable to make it. So we should all send Karen positive thoughts into the universe so that she recovers quickly from her illness, because it sounds like she's just not feeling too good today. So we do wish Karen a speedy recovery. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Kim Meninger. Kim Meninger is an executive coach, TEDx speaker, and host of the Impostor Syndrome Files podcast. She helps individuals and organizations to understand and embrace the human experience at work to reach their full leadership potential. Kim has coached hundreds of clients and has presented on career advancement and leadership topics to corporate, nonprofit, and academic audiences. She leverages her psychology degree, MBA, and over a decade of experience as a high-tech leader to empower professionals to lead themselves and others more effectively. Kim is especially passionate about helping women and members of other historically marginalized groups to become more confident, visible, and influential leaders. Kim has a BA in psychology and an MBA from Boston College. She is an ICF professional certified coach and CCE board certified coach with certifications in confidence, career, executive, and leadership development coaching. Kim also holds a certificate in executive leadership from Cornell University. BFFs, please join me in welcoming to the podium.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Pam mentioned, I tend to describe the work I do as really focused on helping people navigate what makes it hard to be human at work. So there are a lot of skills and competency-based trainings, but I like to look at the messy human side, like what if I know what I'm supposed to do, but I have imposter syndrome, or I have a lot of anxiety, or I don't feel connected to my colleagues, I don't feel like I have enough psychological safety. So that's the lens that I bring to every conversation that I have, and I'm thrilled to be able to have a conversation with all of you today about this concept of imposter syndrome, which is near and dear to my heart. A big part of my experience when I worked in high tech a number of years ago, and I'll share more of my personal story as well. Despite the fact that this topic is discussed more now than ever, there's still somewhat of a stigma attached to it. We still hesitate to share our experiences with others, and we tend to look around and think everybody else has it all figured out. It must just be me. And so I think it's really important, as part of this conversation, to normalize the experience so that everybody knows that we're all in this together. Most of us have experiences, real experiences, at some time throughout our careers. The research is mixed, but it shows that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 85% of people will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lifetime. So there's more of us who do experience it than those who do not. And so what I'd like to do today is to share a little bit about imposter syndrome, but also give you some specific strategies that you can use when you leave here, if and when you encounter these types of feelings. I would love to encourage you to ask questions as we're going through the program. Do not feel like you have to save your questions until the end. Oh, it's working on the There we go. Okay, I always like to start by sharing some statements that characterize the experience of imposter syndrome. And as I read these to you, I want you to be thinking about whether these resonate with you. It could be something that you're feeling right this very moment. It could be something that you've experienced years ago in another part of your life or in your career. So the first is, my success is a result of luck and timing, not my skills and effort. Others are going to find out that I'm not as good as they think I am. I've inadvertently deceived people and think I'm good enough to do this job. I feel undeserving of my success. And at any moment, I may be exposed as a fraud. So I would love to encourage you to be bold and brave. And if this has ever been true for you, and you don't have to share any of the details, it doesn't have to be right now, would you raise your hand if you've ever felt this way? So this is, I always love this question, and I smile not in celebration of your pain, I know it all too well, but because I do think that that's such a powerful effect to be able to look around and see all these women that you probably think, her, she feels this way, right? It's really helpful to recognize that we're all on this journey together, and we do a really good job of hiding it. So what is imposter syndrome? Some of you may know a lot about this topic, others you might be just getting introduced to it, so I want to give you a little bit of background. It's a term that was first coined back in the late 70s, or actually it was coined as the imposter phenomenon back in the late 70s by a couple of female psychologists at Georgia State University who were doing research with a fairly small, non-diverse group of female graduate students. And they were looking at that feeling of, I'm a fraud, I'm going to be found out. And they used the term imposter phenomenon to describe those feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy, despite the fact that to the outside world we're doing great. We're meeting our goals, on paper everything looks good, but inside there's that disconnect. And it feels like it's only a matter of time before everybody realizes that I belong here or that I don't know what I'm doing. And all of the early research was focused exclusively on women. It was assumed that only women experience this. More recent studies have revealed that it's actually gender agnostic, that anybody can experience it. What's interesting about imposter syndrome is that it often strikes high achievers. So it's the people you least expect to struggle with this kind of self-doubt because they tend to have long proven track records. But if you peel it back a bit, it starts to make sense because imposter syndrome is often triggered by stepping outside of your comfort zone, doing something different from what you were doing before. So when you take on a new role, take on new responsibilities, you are reminded of what you don't know. There's that sense of I'm a beginner again, especially if I've been accustomed to being a high performer in another environment. And high performers do this more often. They're more likely to move themselves out of their comfort zones and take on new challenges. So if you were in the same role for 20 years, doing the same thing day in and day out, no new challenges, nothing surprised you, there's not really a trigger there for imposter syndrome. But if you're growing and moving yourself into new situations on a regular basis, you're more likely to feel this. It's also most common among people who feel different from the majority group around them. So if you're the only of any demographic group in a room, you're going to be more likely to feel this way. We tend to be much more cognizant of what makes us different than what makes us similar. What does it look like? I'm going to share some of the manifestations. These are not all inclusive and not everybody will experience all of them, but it'll give you a good sense of what it looks like. And this is helpful both for yourself as well as for others. If you manage other people, if you work with peers, if you have children who may be experiencing this, it's helpful to be on the lookout for these types of behaviors because it will allow you to support them in a more effective way. So the first is just that general self-doubt, right? I'm not good enough and people are going to find that out. And it could result in some hesitation to get involved in new types of activities. So the one I see often, I work a lot with women who work in organizations, and they will tell me that they are afraid to speak up in meetings because they feel like if it were a good idea, somebody else would share it. Right? So there's this unwillingness to take that risk and put yourself out there. They tend to sit on the sidelines and play small. There might be a reluctance to take risks, again, to raise your hand for that new opportunity, to go after that new challenge. Perfectionism is one of the hallmarks of imposter syndrome. They're very tightly correlated. And what's really unfortunate about perfectionism is that although we tend to intellectually understand that perfectionism is not achievable, we still put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and we tend to joke about it, right? Like, oh, I'm a perfectionist, we wear it as a badge of honor, but perfectionism is exhausting. And what often happens is we don't make a good distinction between something where good enough is actually good enough, and something where it actually warrants additional time and attention. And so a lot of times we're using energy on things like rereading the email 10 times before pushing send, instead of channeling that energy in a more productive direction, either for your work or for your life. Micromanagement can be an expression of imposter syndrome as well. If you are promoted to a new manager role and you're not given a lot of direction on what that should look like, or you are very comfortable with the skills that got you to that level, but you're less comfortable now with leading and getting things done through others, you may take comfort in the activities that got you to that point. And in the process, you end up stepping on the toes of the people who should theoretically be empowered to now do that work themselves. Also, if you are a perfectionist and you have that perfectionism and those expectations of yourself, you may apply those same perfectionistic tendencies to other people. And if you've ever worked for a micromanager, you know how demoralizing that can be. Finally, we tend to see overcompensating behaviors, a little bit like signs of strength or signs of power. So if you see people who flex their muscles and try to be the smartest person in the room, you might think of that as a show of strength, but actually that's a show of insecurity, because if you really know what you're good at and what you're not good at, true confidence is quiet. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. So a lot of times we might see this in men, or we might see this in women that we experience as bullies, people who are overly aggressive, right? And I think it's important to understand that, because a lot of times they intimidate us. But if you can see it for what it is, which is a sign of insecurity, you can at least reframe it in your own mind. It doesn't make it any less unpleasant to work with people who treat you that way, but at least you know it's about them and not about you. And now I want to turn to sharing some strategies. Any questions before I jump into the strategies? Okay. So the first one that I want to share with you is really tying this back to just our natural way in which we respond as humans to potential threat situations. So this was really helpful for me to think about it this way, because I've had a lifelong anxiety disorder. I'm somebody who's very prone to catastrophizing. I overthink a lot of things. I can ruminate really well. And so I think that really thinking about imposter syndrome as just an expression of that very natural fear response that we all have can help us to better understand what's happening and to intervene before it gets out of control. So we all have that primitive part of our brain, that lizard brain that's on alert at all times to scan the environment for danger, right? So we're always looking, and some of us have more sensitive, I think of this as a security system. Think about a security system in your home, right, that maybe sets off false alarms. Some of us have more sensitive security systems that are setting off lots of false alarms. Some maybe don't. And so for me in particular, my alarm systems are going off all the time, right? But our alarm systems don't do a very good job of distinguishing between the threat of an actual predator that's coming to get you versus the threat of humiliation, rejection, or failure, which is the three things that we fear most as humans outside of physical harm. And it actually activates the pain centers in our brain when we experience those things. So our brain is always looking at where the potential for those threats lie. And so when we experience imposter syndrome, it can be helpful to think of that as an expression of our fight or flight response. So that fight or flight response gets triggered when we detect a threat, and that's designed to keep us alive. What happens when we find ourselves in a fight or flight state is that all of our resources get allocated to simply allow us to escape the situation, and we lose access to the cognitive part of our brain that allows us to reason and problem solve. So one of the things I hear a lot of women say is, I don't know what happens. It's like I step into this room and I lose my ability to form a coherent thought. I can't articulate what I want to say, I freeze. I had that conversation probably 3 or 4 times over the course of a week or two, and I thought to myself, time out, right? These are really intelligent, highly capable women who do not do this when they're in rooms with other people that they trust, with their families, with their friends, right? What's happening is they're walking into this room and their brain is saying, you're not safe here. They're going into fight or flight mode and they're interpreting that as reinforcement of their belief that they're not good enough to be in that room. Instead of seeing it as, oh, this is my reaction to a perceived threat, right? They're seeing it as a validation of their limiting beliefs about themselves. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize what that fight or flight response looks like and when it's likely to show up, because we can anticipate those situations and prepare for them. One of the best things that you can do if you find yourself in that situation is to take deep breaths. I know it sounds cliche, but what happens is when you are in a threat situation or a perceived threat situation and you take a deep breath, you are sending a very clear signal to your brain that you're not actually in danger. You would not be able to do that if you were being chased by a tiger, right? So it actually does disrupt the process. I'm also a big believer in keeping a drink with you at all times because it gives you a pause button. If you're not sure what you want to say, if you suddenly get really nervous, you can slow down by taking a sip of water, collect yourself, and then move back into the conversation. And then pace your speech. The act of slowing down how you speak actually engages the cognitive part of your brain, and so it keeps you from being fully in this very anxiety-driven part that, again, you can't really reason within. So just think about how you're pacing yourself. You also look like you're more in command of your message, and people will respond to you accordingly. One of the things that I often recommend is that you plan for what you're most afraid of. Because if you know what you'll do in that situation, then everything else feels manageable. So for many of us, we fear being in a situation where we're asked a question we don't know the answer to. Right? It's like, I don't want to be seen as incompetent. I don't want to be seen as unworthy of being part of this conversation that I'm part of. So the reality is someday that's going to happen. You can't predict everything that will ever be asked of you. So come up with some strategies for what you will do when that happens. And then when you walk into that room, you're going to feel much more confident and more prepared. Any questions? Yes.
Do you have a suggestion? Because I can recognize several times that I've been in that space where my self-talk starts, right? And I can't shut that off. So is there a tool that?
Yeah, so there's a few things I think about is you contribute before your inner critic has a chance to catch up. Because once you take action, right, you actually stop the thinking. What we often think is we need to be confident first, and then we'll take whatever the action is that we want to take, whether that's speaking up or doing something that's a little bit bigger than that, right? But I think if we just know that voice is really, I've heard it described as the fight response turned inward, which I think is really interesting, right? So it's your brain's way of saying, essentially, this is dangerous, get out of here. And it's doing it in a very dramatic, nasty way, so it will get your attention. If it were kind and gentle, you wouldn't listen to it. So I find it helpful when I hear that voice that's starting to tell me all these nasty things, is to say, I know what you're trying to do here, right? Thank you. I think of it as my overactive bodyguard. And I say, thank you, but I got this, right? I don't need you right now. And so if you could just build, it sounds cheesy, but if you just build a relationship with that voice, don't accept it at face value. You think of it as like a crying child that needs attention, like on your leg, right? It's not gonna go away. You're not gonna be able to push it away. You just have to give it the reassurance that it needs that you're safe, that you're okay. And so I think part of it is recognizing that that's what's happening when it's happening. And then the other piece, like I said, is just knowing you're never going to feel confident until you do it. Once you do it, you realize the sky didn't fall, or I'm still standing, the world didn't collapse. Then we start to build that resilience, we build those muscles, and it makes it easier to take that risk the next time around. Yes?
This segues right on to that. Sometimes, if I get the imposter syndrome, I'll feel like that you can't do it, and then perfectionism pops in, and then procrastination. So I don't even get to the point of doing it. What do I do there?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in setting perfectionism limits for yourself, right? So if you know that you're a perfectionist and you want to read things, set a limit. I'm only going to look at this for 10 minutes, and then wherever it is good enough. Because your good enough is probably better than most people's.
You know, that's right.
Right, because we put a lot of pressure on ourselves in those situations. I also think from a procrastination standpoint, we give ourselves a lot of criticism for that. We call ourselves lazy, we blame ourselves for that. But if you're procrastinating, there's a reason why, and I think it's worth examining. And a lot of times it's because what you're trying to do is too big to bite into. And so if you think about what's the first step, a lot of times we think, oh, I have to do this big complicated thing, instead of breaking it down to, okay, well, the first thing is I need to do X. And I find it really helpful to schedule that on my calendar. So I think our brains think they're doing us a favor by keeping things in short-term memory so we don't forget them, but what that ends up doing is just ruminating, and we replay it, and it keeps us from being present and focused on other things. So what I have found to be really helpful is to say, okay, if I know I need to, let's say I need to create a new presentation and I'm procrastinating, I'm gonna actually allocate time on my calendar just like I would any other meeting that I would commit to. And then when my brain starts to say, you're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, I can say, oh, actually, Friday at 10 is my time for that. And then it just sort of gives my brain the reassurance, we've got that covered, I can move on, I don't need to keep replaying it. Just kind of brain hacks. Thank you, good question. The next one, some of you might be familiar with this concept of a growth mindset. So Carol Dweck is a researcher, I believe at Stanford, who's done this research where she makes a distinction between a fixed mindset, which is that belief that we're born with everything that we're capable of. So if, for example, I think I'm not good at math, I assume, well, I was just born that way. I don't have a math gene, right? And so there's no point in my trying to get better at math. Whereas if I have a growth mindset, I believe more so that I'm in control of my own destiny. So I may not feel like I'm good at math today, but I can invest, if I choose to, in more resources to help me get there. Maybe I can practice harder, I can get a tutor, or I can do things differently that will help me to improve in that area. And when you have a growth mindset, you're less likely to experience imposter syndrome. And part of it is reminding ourselves, because we tend to get very laser focused on the particular situation that we're in today, to remind ourselves that we were not born with any of the strengths and capabilities that we take for granted today. So there are things that you do automatically, you probably dismiss as no big deal, right, that we just don't even think about, but at one point, those things were scary and new as well. And so it can be really helpful to zoom out and to look at our bigger arc of life, and when you're finding yourself in a new situation that's triggering you, and you're saying to yourself, I can't do this. Right? I'm gonna fail, I can't do this. Just to remind yourself, this is just one incremental step on a journey you've been on your whole life. And if you think about it, if you have children and you've ever watched children learn to walk, right? I have 2 boys that are gonna be 8 and 13 in the next couple of months. And watching them learn to walk was really an interesting, I would say, view of the growth mindset, because they fall and they get back up again, and they keep falling and they keep getting up again. Imagine if when we were learning to walk, said, I just don't have a walking gene, right? I'm just not cut out for walking, right? We don't do that when we're growing as children. We do that as adults as a way of protecting ourselves from failure, rejection, and humiliation. And so it's really important to remind ourselves that whenever we are doing something new, of course we can't do it well. We're the only ones who expect ourselves to have mastered something before we've ever tried it. And so to put it into perspective, I'm learning. And some of you might be familiar with the concept of the power of yet. So when you find yourself telling yourself you're not good at something, to say, I'm not good at something yet. But I have the choice as to whether I get better at it or not. And one thing that can be really helpful is to deliberately try things that you are not good at yet. Because we do a really good job, especially those of us who are perfectionists, at curating our worlds in such a way that we don't do anything that we're not guaranteed we will do well. And so we lose the ability to build those resilience muscles. And so we don't remember the last time we failed. We think of it as this catastrophic possibility, but it's really been a long time since we've actually been in that situation. And so it can be really helpful to put yourself in these situations in your personal life where the stakes are lower, and to say, I'm gonna try to play a new instrument, or learn a new language, or do some kind of physical activity that I've never done before, and to be okay with not getting it right perfectly. This is something my husband actually brought to my attention. We maybe take our kids bowling like twice a year. It's not something we do very often, and I'm so competitive, and every time we go, I get so frustrated that, I'm always getting a better ball, and I don't do it well. And he looked at me one time and he said, how arrogant of you to think you'd be a perfect bowler when we do this maybe twice a year, right? And I was like, it stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, you know what, he is exactly right. Like, he's like, just have fun, why do you care? And I thought, how often are we doing that to ourselves? The beginning of a new role and the beginning of anything new is that we are beating ourselves up because we're not perfect at something that we've never done before. So zooming out, keeping that perspective, and really paying attention to that power of yet can be really helpful. Owning your success is a really important part of this process. I was really glad that the icebreaker was what's your greatest strength, because I think women in particular have a tough time answering that question. Usually it's because we're so aware of what we don't do well, we don't really think about what we do well, and also we've been conditioned socially not to think about ourselves in strengths-based terms. We've been taught not to brag, to be humble, and so sometimes it feels almost inappropriate to talk about ourselves in positive ways, and so there's this awkwardness that comes with saying I'm good at something. But one thing that I will say is that while it's great for us to be aware of what we need to develop and where we can get stronger and continue to challenge ourselves, it is really important that we also balance that with an unapologetic acceptance of the fact that we already have strengths. There is nothing shameful about that, and it's not an ego-driven exercise. What you do well is your raw material to contribute to your work, to contribute to your family, to contribute to your community. And so if we don't understand what our strengths are, then we can't make the kind of impact that we want to have. And so I think about understanding our strengths really as allowing us to maximize our service to other people. And so one of the ways that we can do this is to keep an accomplishments journal. Every day or two, I would say don't go more than a week, because you won't remember, you won't have the same emotional attachment to it. Just write down. Get into the habit at the end of every day to write down 3 things that I'm proud of today. What are the problems that I solved, right? What am I celebrating? What are some things that I crossed off my to-do list? It doesn't have to be monumental. Don't filter, because you'll start asking yourself, is this really an accomplishment, right? Don't overthink it, just write it down. And if you think about it, this has a lot of benefits. I mean, certainly it has benefits practically as well, if you're ever going to update your resume, or if you have any kind of performance evaluations, anything of that nature. But from a confidence perspective, you can think about it almost like a gratitude journal. You know, if you keep a gratitude journal every day, you write down what you're grateful for, you actually train your brain to scan the environment for what you're grateful for, because you want something to write down. And that means there's less space for the negative. If you're writing down every day what you're doing well, you are training your brain to think about yourself in a more strengths-based way. So I would encourage everybody to do that, and to think of that as just a natural part of how you manage your career from this point forward. Leverage your resources. This one was a game changer for me. I stumbled into high tech a couple years out of college. I have a psychology degree, always thought that I would go onto a PhD program in clinical psychology. When that didn't happen for various reasons, it was the peak of the dot-com boom. I had a friend who said, why don't you come work on my team at EMC? I went in there enthusiastically, found that my psychology degree really helped me with the human side of business, but I knew nothing about the technology, and I found myself in meetings with product managers and engineers where it literally felt like they were speaking a foreign language, and I didn't have a dictionary and had no idea what they were talking about. And I can remember sitting in meetings thinking to myself, I am one question away from this whole house of cards collapsing. Everyone is going to realize I have no business being in this room. And it was really anxiety-provoking for a while. And finally I said to myself, I need to solve this problem. And my first thought, and many of you may be able to relate to this, I think women have a tendency to want the definitive textbook, that we just study it and we'll get better at it. I said, I know, I'll just go back to school. I'll get a master's in software engineering, and that will solve the problem. Then I'll be able to communicate in their language. So I actually took 3 courses before I realized that's probably not the path for me. As a plan B, I reached out to our executive vice president of engineering. At the time, he was probably 7 levels above me, but we had both gone to BC. And I reached out to him, and I just asked for some career advice. And I said to him, sometimes I feel like I'm in a little over my head in these technical conversations. Do you think I should get an engineering degree if I want to advance within the company? And he literally looked at me like I was nuts, and he goes, get an engineering need an engineering degree, you're surrounded by engineers. He said, if you need to have a technical conversation, bring a technical person into the room with you. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know what you don't know and build relationships with people who have those skills. And I remember it was like this huge weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. And I walked out of that room, and it occurred to me that nowhere in my resume, not in my interviews, not in any conversation that I had ever had with a single person in this company, had I ever presented myself as a technical person. It's not like I was misleading people. I didn't lie about it, yet they continue to invite me to these meetings. There must be another reason why I'm here. And as soon as I could shift the perspective to, I'm not here to compete with Bob from engineering who has 20 years of experience I don't have and frankly don't want. I'm here for another reason. I was a relationship manager. My job was to manage partnerships. As soon as I could focus on that, then I found my own stride and was able to build my confidence. And I would encourage all of you to think about where you're putting pressure on yourself to know everything, be everything, do everything. I think about it as almost like a Swiss Army knife, right? We as women want to be every tool in the Swiss Army knife, as opposed to thinking of our broader teams, our peer groups, our networks as the Swiss Army knife, and we play maybe one or two of the tools in that knife. And so I thought this actually helped me when I became an entrepreneur too, to take some of the pressure off, because when you're an entrepreneur, you also feel like, I'm the only one, I have to wear all the hats, but there are people all around you who have the skills and strengths that you don't have, and would love to do the things that you don't want to do. So whether you work for others or you work for yourself, I think this can be a really powerful reminder to say, okay, why am I here? Not to compete. I'm not here because, I'm not going to compare myself to other people. I'm going to focus on what I'm here to do, and I'm going to leverage the resources that I have available to me. Oh, this was, I know we just scratched the surface, so I created this free guide. It's an email challenge, so if you sign up every day for 7 days, you'll get some more self-reflection questions, exercises to help you dig a little bit more deeply into this. You can find it at yourcareersuccess.com/links. I also did a TEDx talk on the topic we were just discussing around why am I in this room. And if we have some time, I'd love to take any additional questions that you might have. Oh, sorry. I also follow a lot of resources. I share a lot of content on LinkedIn related to the themes that we talked about today. So if you're interested in connecting with me there, I'd love to have you as part of my network, and it's another way for you to get access to other resources.
I just want to say thank you. This was awesome. I really loved the last part around leveraging your resources and just like the subtle mindset shift, like where to focus. And then identifying when we're putting undue, like really unnecessary pressure on ourselves. And it's like, that's not even why I'm here in the first place, so that's a relief. So that I could just really relate to that. One thing I wanted to say, I had this logical sort of understanding, like, well, no, I'm not a perfectionist, like, that's dumb, because, I'll never win there, but I feel like I was still in that striving for perfectionism, but knowing it was not a good idea. So one of my mentors, this is more into the sort of personal growth and development, had me shift my mind from, am I a perfectionist, not a perfectionist, to like progress, not perfection. So that was really helpful. And then I guess my question as I'm reflecting here, thank you for allowing me to reflect out loud.
Yes.
As a fellow entrepreneur, I'm wondering, how is it that you have people know you as or do you call yourself as a life, not a life coach, a career, what's your?
I call myself a leadership or executive coach.
A leader, yes, executive coach. So in the sort of arguably saturated space of coaches, executive coaches, how do you position yourself? How do you want people to really know your unique flavor, and how have you experienced getting that out, especially in the very sort of virtual, digital age?
So I do a lot of speaking, and I do a lot of speaking related to these kinds of themes. So I have a brand that's associated with imposter syndrome, confidence more specifically. Also my LinkedIn, I share content twice a day. I share articles from other people. I consider it, so I'm not a writer and I have no time for creating my own content. And so I think I don't write my own greeting cards. I'm not writing my own blog posts. So I just take the blog posts that best reflect my perspective on things, and then I share them with my community.
That's an example of leveraging your resources.
Exactly. And so I think because I have a lot of people who follow me on LinkedIn, they associate me with the content I share. And so one thing I will say as an entrepreneur is that I put a lot of pressure on myself in the beginning to be everywhere and try to do everything. It doesn't work. Now I pick two things. I speak, and that includes my podcast, and then I'm on LinkedIn.
Well, I am definitely bringing your work in front of my 20-somethings. They will get so much from
Oh, thank
your
you.
work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pam.
You talked a lot about a lot of the internal reasons for imposter syndrome and pressures. Can you speak a little bit to some external
Yes.
things, maybe like microaggressions
Absolutely.
in the workplace, and how to navigate those or what impact those might have on your imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. So when I have more time, I often spend some time in the presentation talking about, I share a response to an article that some of you may be familiar with that was written a few years ago in the Harvard Business Review called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And it was a really important article that took issue with the fact that we tell women that they have imposter syndrome, because essentially what we're doing is we're pathologizing the individual woman's experience, when a large part of why she feels that way is because of systemic bias and racism in the workplace, so for women of color in particular. And so there is a frustration with making it the individual woman's responsibility to solve this problem, when really it's a bigger issue. My response to that is absolutely. There's a lot that we need to do at a systemic level to change the environments, to create more inclusion, more psychological safety, more equity. At the same time, whether you call it imposter syndrome or you call it something else, there are a lot of people that are experiencing these feelings on an everyday basis. And so if we shift our focus entirely away from the individual to the system, which none of us can individually control, then we kind of give our power away, because where does that leave us? We still need tools to navigate these feelings that we're having. So I think that part of it is a collective responsibility that we all have to be thinking about how much psychological safety exists within our environment. I'm a big believer that if we get psychological safety right, inclusion follows automatically. We're treating people with respect, we're treating them as humans, right? And so every one of us has a role in that. Oftentimes we think that that is HR's job, or it's the leadership team's job. But in any kind of a meeting where you can be looking around to see, are we creating space for enough voices? Are only the loudest and the fastest able to speak? And what does that mean for everybody else, right? Are we letting people interrupt each other? Are we letting people behave in disrespectful or toxic ways within our environments? And each one of us has to use our own judgment depending on the cultural norms and values of our systems to decide whether we can speak up in that moment. But I think at the end of the day, it's also important to remember that we have choices. And a lot of times women in particular tend to feel like, I should just feel grateful that I have a job, and I'm not going to rock the boat or challenge the system in some way. And so we subject ourselves to behaviors that we're not, that we deserve better. And so I think to just ask ourselves, is this an environment where I can do my best work? I often believe that if you had decided this is not the right place for me, it's the best time to do some of the inner work, because you're already kind of have one foot out the door anyway. It's a great practice ground for building your own boundaries, right? Practicing being assertive, practicing, demanding different behaviors so that you can take them with you wherever you go next. But I do think that it's very important that we think about this as a systemic issue. And if you think about it too, within an organization, I mentioned that 80 to 85% of the population is going to experience imposter syndrome. It's very common among knowledge workers, right? It's very common among people who feel different. You can assume that every organization has a critical mass of people who experience imposter syndrome, and those people are sitting there thinking to themselves, if someone else, or if this were a good idea, someone else would have shared it. Like, what are you losing? You are losing out on innovation and creativity because people feel like they can't safely share their ideas. You've got managers all over the place that are overcompensating for their insecurities, right? By standing in the way of their very talented teams who could be doing so much more. And so this really is a much bigger issue than we treat it by talking about it at just an individual level.
So, the kind of taking planned tasks and do them in a different allotted time really spoke to me, but that's not always practical. So in the context of, I think a lot of us have experienced this or are going to experience this, even across the people in the room, as far as being a mom and being, you know, a salesperson, executive, entrepreneur, whatever your role is, I find it's constantly firing in my mind when I'm at work. All the crap I'm not doing that my kids need. And when I'm at home, I'm thinking, oh shit, I let all that fall through the cracks because I'm too focused on what I'm doing for my kids right now. Do you have any just thoughts or
Ask for help. I can fix that too much on herself. I mean, I was just having this conversation yesterday, right? Men, there's a lot of reasons for this. Men aren't triggered by the same things that we're triggered by. And so they don't feel the need to do everything themselves. They don't feel that need to prove themselves. They take pride in saying, I don't have time for that. They take pride in setting boundaries with their manager, right? And there is a difference when women show up in certain ways than when men show up. But I think there's also this reality that men tend to have more personal types of relationships with their managers, and leaders are still primarily white men. And so they have these kind of side conversations about what's challenging for them and what they have time to do and what they don't have time to do. And women feel like I need to prove myself, I need to do everything, and I need to do it perfectly at home, at work, and every other area of my life. And I think it's really important that we recognize that that's not possible, and that the higher we go within an organization or the more responsibility we take on, that something's got to give. We can't continue to do everything ourselves. So whether that's hiring somebody to help with certain things at home, or talking to your manager about what's realistic and what isn't when you're in the workplace, just really being honest with yourself. It's really important. And I think for me, as a working mom, what I have found really helpful too is to shift from guilt to gratitude. And when I find myself working and feeling guilty that I'm not spending time with my kids, to say, I'm really grateful that I have a husband who is tending to my kids right now so that I can focus on growing my business. And when I'm with my kids and I'm not working, to say, I'm really grateful that I have a job that's flexible enough that I can spend time with my kids and still do my job, right? And so I think a lot of it is just how the story we tell ourselves around what we're doing, because otherwise we get caught up in this cycle of guilt and shame that never goes away because we can't. I read this article once that I thought was really helpful for those who are in like knowledge work, right? Back in the day, if you went to a factory and you had to get 50 things done and you did that, you walk out the door and you feel this sense of satisfaction. I achieved my goal, I finished my day, I'm going home. Now there's always more to do. There's never an end to the to-do list, and so there's this constant pressure on us, and I should be doing more, I should be doing more, I should be doing more, and we're just not capable of doing that much more. Our brains can't handle it, so letting ourselves off the hook when we're legitimately doing something else besides working. Any other questions? Thank you.